Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Sadani, and I am the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Women Reimagine the MENA region, a conversation we're holding this month as the world marked International Women's Day a few weeks ago. The Middle East and North Africa region finds itself in a critical moment of transition. As Syrians re-envision their country's future following the fall of a 54-year entrenched and brutal Assad regime, as the people of Lebanon reimagine what a just political and economic future looks after a change in government following 2 years of stalemate, as Sudanese civilians mobilize to bring an end to the war, and as the people of Gaza reflect on what a just reconstruction may look for them, women across the region have, of course, been disproportionately impacted in the lead up to these moments. They've been targeted as journalists, first responders, and healthcare practitioners. They've been subject to political exclusion, harassment offline and online, arrest and disappearance. And yet women across all these spaces, be they humanitarian aid workers, economists, political leaders, advocates, they've all had and will continue to have a transformational impact on their societies and on the future trajectories of their countries and the region. At today's event, we're hoping to unpack how women have been affected in these developments and how women are organizing and mobilizing as we look ahead. Today, I'll be leaving you in the hands of my extremely talented colleague, Misha Tobia, who will moderate today's conversation. Misha is the editorial manager at Time Up. She's also the co-founder of Mashallah News and has previously worked at the Policy Initiative and the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. Misha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, May. These are really critical but tough times for our region and our people, as we're going through historic moments that will surely impact the many decades to come. Today's conversation will focus on 4 countries: Sudan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, specifically Gaza, as each of these countries have many things in common. They have gone through or are still going through wars and genocides, are undergoing political shifts, economic crises, and their people are mobilizing in all kinds of ways. Women and girls have been disproportionately impacted by wars and genocides. Sexual and gender violence has been specifically used as a tool of war in several of those countries. And women find themselves leading households after so many of their men have been killed, arrested, or forcibly disappeared. And women have been the object of harassment campaigns, targeted for their work, and excluded from political talks. But at the same time, women have a huge role to play. They're active on the ground, but also in exile and diaspora, as they're organizing and leading movements, putting forward solutions, and pushing hard to reimagine a different and possible future. So today's conversation will cover all of these things, hopefully. How have women been impacted, but also how are they pushing to reimagine a different future? It's my honor to introduce today's speakers, as they've been incredibly inspiring people whose work I've followed for years. First, we have Hala Al-Karib, who is the Regional Director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa Network, SIHA. She's a Sudanese and African feminist, activist, and community organizer with over 20 years of experience. Then we have Sana Mustafa, who's a movement leader in the forced displacement sector and a feminist human rights activist. She's a member of Syria's first Syrian women's political movement. Then we have Miriam Sfer, who's the executive director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University. She has over 25 years of experience working in women's rights and gender equality. And last, but certainly not least, we have Paula Salwan Daher, who is the Senior Director for Collective Action at Women Deliver. She has previously worked at the Center for Reproductive Rights, the Center for Research and Training on Development Action, and the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. Today's conversation is a moderated discussion. We'll have 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll open up questions to the audience. For everyone who's interested in asking questions, you can submit them throughout the discussion, and we'll turn to them at that point. I'm going to start with Hala first. And about Sudan. All reports about the Sudan war show the disproportionate impact of the war for women and girls. With over 5.8 million women and girls internally displaced, women and girls being disproportionately impacted by food insecurity, the lack of water, sanitation, hygiene, and access to care. And unfortunately, sexual and gender violence has been one of the key characteristics of the war. Could you give us an overview of the situation on the ground and tell us how things have been for women and girls, especially after the start of the war? For instance, what type of violations have you documented in Sudan since April 2023?
Thank you very much for the space, Michelle, and thanks to the Tahrir Institute. I'm quite honored and pleased to be among such prominent group of women activists, different ages, different backgrounds, and also they are going to reflect on different contexts that's happening right now for all of us in the Middle East and North Africa region. And, absolutely, you have said it very clearly. These are very, very difficult times for all of us, where the violence against civilians has been quite normalized. And, violence against women, it's something that nobody even stop and think about it. The scale of violation that's happening to women and girls, the scale of violence, it's unprecedented in Sudan. Having said that, Sudan is no stranger to violence against civilians and violence against women. But the accumulations of grievances and accumulations of impunity, a lack of justice, and poor rule of law has enabled, in my view, in addition to other factors, relating to the geopolitics of Sudan, has enabled this brutal campaign of atrocities to take place. For the women and girls in Sudan to be the center of these violations. This war that is happening in Sudan is, it's fought with women bodies. Our bodies are tools of wars. It's also fought inside women's homes, inside, women's bedrooms, and inside, our roads and farms, and it affected women and girls and schools and hospitals and maternity hospitals. So it affected us in every possible way. And, what's really, and I'm going to speak about that later, what's really, unacceptable is the level of neglect, to women experiences and what they are going through, particularly, their experience with conflict-related sexual violence, which is happening in unprecedented scale. For more than 30 years, Sudan has a long history with conflict-related sexual violence at the peripheries of the countries where subsequent Sudanese governments have been, involved and implicated in using women's bodies, as a war strategies to suppress, the rebellions by marginalized communities. And, the same groups that has been militarized by the Sudanese regimes for very long time, they are now turning from being a proxy force, the Janjaweed, the Rapid Support Forces right now, into, an actor that they felt that they are entitled to take control of the country, and and the war has erupted as a result of their dispute with their creators, which is Sudan Armed Forces. And in the middle, women and girls were caught on this. We have, we have been working in territories and regions like Darfur for the past over 20 years. We are quite familiar with, the fact that civilians and women bodies are used as tools of war. And so we understood very well from the beginning that, it's not going to be different. And this is exactly what happened. Sexual violence has started in this recent war in Sudan, this campaign of atrocity since April 15. And it started to happen in central Khartoum, the going door to door, the raping of women inside their homes, the abductions, the act of slavery and keeping women hostages for very long time, the looting, and so on. So and then from there, the scale of the war has expanded, and we started to see, extensive patterns of enforced disappearances, extensive patterns of, women being killed, women being executed, for, any forms of resistance. I would like to conclude by saying that conflict-related sexual violence that is happening in Sudan, it's not something isolated from the overall patterns of repressions, of communities. It's very much connected to land grabbing. It's very much connected to forced evictions of communities, and it's very much linked to breaking communities and breaking their acts, any acts of resistance. This is what's happening right now. The damage, even if this war ended tomorrow, the damage, the mental health that happen, to communities, the disintegration, the grievances, as long as there is no foreseen tools and strategies that will address, these patterns of violations, will have a significant ramifications, and there will be no peace that is happening in Sudan sooner. I would like also to speak about patterns of criminalizations of women, post RSF, when the rapid support forces being driven out of a certain territory. Then, women have to live through, those who remain behind, they have to live through, accusations of criminalizations of being collaborators with the RSF. And right now we have hundreds of women who are jailed and in prisons and, under the accusations of being collaborators. So the burden, the mental health burden, psychological burden, all type of, burdens of these conflicts is lying on the shoulder of women. Yeah, over to you, Misha.
Thank you so much, Hala, for this very sobering analysis of the situation. Next now, my next question is for Sana in Syria. The Syrian civil society and women organizers in particular have been active for years opposing the Assad regime and working for an alternative to it. Could you lay out what women have done through the years up until now in terms of political organizing on the ground, but also in the diaspora? And how did this work help prepare for all the current work that is being done right now in this post-Assad transition?
Yeah, thank you, Misha. And hello to everyone, and thank you, May and Tahrir Institute, for creating this really important conversation. First, I want to celebrate the fact that, my country in December gladly got rid of the Assad regime finally. I wouldn't say it's we got liberated fully. I think this is kind of one of our objectives. We achieved one of the 2011 revolution objective, which is to topple the Assad regime, and our fight continues. And yeah, ever since, December, Syria entered a new chapter, a new phase, and it has its own challenges. But more to answer your question, I will think about and talk about more before December 2024. Of course, unfortunately, worth mentioning that everything that Hala was talking about in terms of Sudan, a lot of it unfortunately apply on Syria, whether in the last 14 years or even before the war and the revolution. Because just to be very clear, and I think now that we have a new government that has more of an Islamist background, suddenly everyone cares about women's rights in Syria more than before, assuming that Syrian women had rights in Syria before during the so-called secular Assad regime. And everyone knows, no, they did not. And the oppression and the systematic oppression and the violation of human rights and women's rights in Syria continue. And they started, with the Assad regime, and they haven't stopped. And Syrian women faced this oppression and these violations systematically for the last 50 years. And so in many ways, that means like we're equipped and we're prepared. And just as women all around the world, this oppression we've been resisting that. And there have been many forms of that resistance. Even before the 2011 revolution, right? Syrian women, many of them were organized politically underground, of course, like very low profile. And also, that being said, as a result of the surveillance of the Assad regime and the intelligence, many were caught and detained and tortured and disappeared for decades. Without their families. And that's even way before the Syrian revolution of 2011. And of course, most importantly, after 2011, Syrian women were at the forefront, right, of organizing the revolution, of mobilizing communities, of organizing protests, like kind of really being on the ground when the revolution started. And just as you would expect, the adaptivity of how the situation was evolving in Syria, also our forms of resistance and activism as women also, were very adaptive. And so when there was space to protest and organize, that was done by us. And then also when things have changed and it turned into be a more militarized or militarized conflict. Some women picked up weapons as well and had to fought for their homes and for their children and for their country. And then, when we were forcibly displaced, a lot of the women, as a result of mainly the men being disappeared, detained, and tortured by the Assad regime, had to flee, and they continued to really keep their families together and continue education and integrate in the new countries. And yet, I would say very importantly, keeping very strong involvement and engagement in Syria, even out in exile. And maybe this is when I would want to talk here a bit about some efforts and examples of that. Just one example is the movement that I'm part of, the Syrian Women Political Movement, which is Syria's first ever political movement by women, by Syrian women, for Syrian women. And it was established in 2017. And our members include women from inside Syria and outside Syria. And have always really the main mission of it been not just about Syrian women political participation. I would say most importantly, to really connect Syrian women across the different geographic locations in Syria, the ethnic group, the ethnic backgrounds and class and all of it. And so the members, even way before the December 2024, where we had members who were in Idlib, we had members who were in Northwest Syria, we had members who were under the Assad regime controlled areas, members who are in refugee camps and exile, like in neighboring countries and also in Europe and the US. And so to be able to create such an environment that really brings all of these Syrian women together and brings a platform, right? It created a community like that. This is movement building. I think political work is really about movement building and bringing people together and creating spaces for conversations and then strategizing, right? And mobilizing of how we're going to be involved with the current realities. And our strategies evolved and adapted. And since 2017 until today, there was so much work done amongst us that really prepared for this moment. And I will give a very concrete example. We have these political dialogues that they get facilitated every month between across Syrian women of the movement, right? Inside Syria, outside Syria, different realities and different environments. And every facilitated conversation has a theme. And so sometimes it's like about our vision for the constitution, like Syrian women vision for the Syrian constitution. Sometimes it's about the elections. Sometimes it's about education. Sometimes it's about women's rights in the country. And so these conversations, after they happen and they get facilitated across all these women, they come out with kind of input papers, right? Of like, what is the vision? What are the recommendations? And that being said, like now we have over 17 papers, political papers that are by Syrian women, for Syrian women and for Syria, that really kind of we're trying to put in front of the new government to be like, you know, you don't have time to consult a lot of the Syrian women and have conversations across geography in Syria. So this is a very concrete input. One, right? Like there are many channels, but this is one channel that could feed your thinking and how we think of the new phase. And just one last example, like even when I was in Syria just recently after the December 2024, the fall of the Assad regime, you know, I was there, and between Syrian, you know, I visited Idlib, Aleppo, but also like previously regime-controlled areas. And I was fascinated by the effort of the local efforts and community efforts by Syrian women who stayed there, who couldn't not leave. And they were taking so much initiative to organize their communities, to even create circles as families of the disappeared to grieve and to talk, to create circles, to really take care of different aspects of their towns and their neighborhoods. And that's like, they don't name it, they know it doesn't have the labels and the things that we understand, but these are initiatives that were happening under very difficult circumstances, and they were very organic. And so I think going forward, what would be very important is that we all connect across the different geographies and experiences and continue to have these conversations and feed into the new processes in Syria.
Thank you so much, Sana. That was very interesting, and you prepared for the question in the second round. Next, my question is going to be for Miriam and Lebanon. Given the current state of things in Lebanon after the 2019 revolution and the popular mobilization, and after the Israeli war on the country this past year, the accountability crisis we're facing with unmet demands post-Beirut port blast and the financial collapse, what have been the challenges so far for Lebanese women to organize on the ground in terms of civil society, politics, and grassroots organizing?
I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for this panel that raises very important discussions, and it's so important to have these discussions in public or online as well. So I'm happy to weigh in. So, like whoever knows Lebanon and is not alien to Lebanon, organizing in Lebanon comes with both challenges and opportunities. So Lebanon is currently recovering from a debilitating economic crisis, even though it's been several years since this crisis took place, but it's ongoing. Of course, as you mentioned, the August 4th blast and its ramifications, the destructive Israeli war against Lebanon. So basically, work is underway definitely to rebuild the state, invest in real reforms, and revive the mechanisms of democratic political action. But this situation definitely requires initiating a deep and serious discussion about integrating a feminist approach and how phases of reconstruction and reform in Lebanon need to have a feminist lens. So if we take the example of the Beirut blast, for instance, there was a feminist platform that came about the Beirut blast simply because when reform plans were underway, they failed to mainstream gender in all relief efforts. And given that women and girls and marginalized groups were the hardest hit, women and feminist groups and given that they were the first to mobilize their efforts to basically rectify the situation, a charter of demand was issued by around more than 48 women's rights groups. It was spearheaded by UN Women. This charter of demand moved to become the feminist platform that is still operational until today and led by these organizations. So as you might know as well, like, given that we're in a perpetual situation of crisis, and as you might well know, wars, armed conflict, and all that affect women and girls and marginalized groups the most, especially in light of everything that's happening, we are always told now is not the time, and now is never the time to prioritize these concerns. And I'm not going to give you any new mobilizing thematics that were always there at the time of the October 17 revolution. They are related, of course, to legal reforms, the absence of a unified personal status law, and the disagreement among certain groups. Will we push for that? Will we not? CAFA and a lot of other organizations have been struggling to work on a unified civil law. And of course, work is underway, but discriminatory laws are still there. Of course, strengthening legal protection and ensuring proper enforcement is a challenge as well. That's why it's difficult to fight against gender-based violence. And even though there's a law, implementation, as you might expect, remains very weak, especially if you zoom into the last war, and we don't have the numbers. So I don't profess to have the numbers, and even organizations that are working on this thematic area don't have the numbers yet. But we know definitely, and I know from anecdotal evidence and from forums that we're in, that definitely violence against women took place, sexual violence took place, transactional sex took place as well, and the war had repercussions on women's standing, their dignity, returning back to their homes. The economic crisis also and the war pushed women into precarious work conditions without protection or absence of work. And also, we do not have the data related to the number of women currently, let's say, for instance, in the informal sector. So it's very difficult to mobilize on very many thematic areas simply because there's so much to work on, not to mention the rights of marginalized groups, people with disabilities, migrant domestic workers. So we call, and it's important to call for intersectionality in terms of the work that we do. And I'd like here to give an example of the case of Liliane Shaito. We always forget the names of these women. We always forget what happened. So the Beirut blast happened, and for a lot of people, they're trying to recuperate and recover from the repercussions of the blast. But if we take the issue of Liliane Shaito, for instance, it exemplifies the intersections, and we wrote about that, and we have a whole issue of our journal Araida about it's on the 2-year post the Beirut blast. So this Liliane Shaito, her case exemplifies the intersection between patriarchal control and personal status codes and the stigmatization and alienation experienced by people with disabilities in Lebanon. And not to mention the lack of adequate healthcare support for those who are experiencing long-term effects as a result of this explosion or anything else. So on the day of the explosion, Liliane Shaito went shopping for a birthday present for her husband. Unfortunately, as a result of the blast, she got severely injured in the head, and she was hospitalized. Throwback, a couple of maybe weeks or months later, she was considered an unfit parent. She lost custody of her child as a result of the fact that she became disabled, and she's a living example of how the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures allow a spouse to take full control of her life, of her kids. So basically, she lost custody of her child. Over and above that, she didn't receive the proper medical attention needed simply because as a result of the economic collapse in Lebanon. Her parents lost access to their saving. Healthcare systems could not basically offer the care that she needed, etc., etc. I'm just giving this example to say how a lot of times we forget about how all these problems impede and ruin the lives of women. Not to mention the fact that bridging the divide between feminists and people who ascribe to an intersectional way of doing things, and like the women's movement in general. Not too long ago, and I will talk about that when I maybe answer your other question. Not too long ago, we had an open discussion with different organizations that work on these thematic areas and women's rights in specific. There was us, there was the Arab Human Rights Institute, the Lebanon office, there was ANND, and there was also an organization called Abad, and we were looking into like what next, how can we bridge this divide. So, and I just want to say something. The war in Lebanon did not end, you know, like there's a war that's raging in South Lebanon. People are killed left, right, and center. The ceasefire is basically not respected all the time. And at any time, we run the risk of going to war again. So like it's difficult to mobilize. It's difficult because there's so many thematic areas, and I don't need to spell them out. Quota, the nationality, person status quos, migrant domestic workers, the LGBTIQ community, the lack of law, sexual and reproductive health and rights, the list goes on. And this is happening in a country where women had the right to vote since 1953, and in a country obsessed with quotas and the quota system. So like, I think there's a lot to be done. We need to re-examine and reimagine how working together would lead to better laws, better standing, more and the panel that we did was an open discussion on, and we criticized ourselves. It's important to continuously criticize where we're going wrong and how to move forward. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I highly recommend people to read the article that was published about Lilian Chaito. I think Reuters were the first ones to highlight her case, and which made people discuss it and talk about it and learn her story. Paula, my next question is for you. Can you talk about the impact of Israel's genocide in Gaza in terms of health rights and sexual and reproductive health rights of women and girls? And can you also talk about the reasons behind the inability to mobilize transnationally on this topic?
Thank you very much, Misha, and thank you to the Tahrir Institute for inviting me. I feel very humbled and privileged to be on this panel and to share it with my colleagues. I think one of the things that have been highlighted by what my co-panelists have said is, as for most crises, there is a global and collective failure to recognize and address the gendered impact of conflicts. And I think this is true for Gaza, but this is true for Sudan, for Lebanon, for Syria, and for so many other conflicts. And there is also a collective failure to recognize that conflict and genocide and war exacerbate pre-existing patterns of discrimination and violence against women. When we see the violations, the sexual and reproductive health and rights violations perpetrated by Israel in Gaza, they do not happen in a vacuum. They do not happen overnight. They're the epitome and the culmination of a strategy that has been designed decades ago. I will use the term that has been coined by the Palestinian Feminist Collective, that has been also kind of amplified by the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is the term of reproductive genocide. It's not a term that has been usually used in the SRHR movement, but I think that it is apt to illustrate and identify what is currently taking place. I'm a lawyer, so forgive me to kind of enshrine my presentation in what international law is saying. And for once, I would say that international law hasn't been silent. The International Court of Justice, the Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council on the OPT have expressly recognized that reproductive rights violations perpetrated by Israel as a measure intended to prevent birth is partly constitutive of the crime of genocide, both under the Rome Statute and under the Genocide Convention. And from the outset, I will say that it doesn't matter whether or not Israel is a party of these conventions and treaties. What Israel is perpetrating as part of kind of annihilating life in Gaza is a crime, a war crime, a crime against humanity, and participates to the crime of genocide. And it does so because the international community does so with impunity, because the international community has long established which lives are deemed expendable and which lives matter. The targeting of social reproduction and sexual and reproductive health and rights is as I mentioned, by design, as in they are life-making. What women and girls provide in terms of reproductive labor is what ensures and sustains life in any given territory, and that's the case in Gaza. And in a genocidal project, which by definition seeks to eliminate life, women's and girls' bodies become weaponized. Israel's reproductive rights violations are designed to inflict long-term mental, physical, sexual, and reproductive health harm, and these violations are multi-pronged. So it's not just the targeting of women and girls themselves under intensive shelling. So they are being targeted, and children are being targeted. We have seen that Gaza is a war on children, and it is not by omission just because they are randomly shelling. There is a targeting of women, girls, and children because there is a willingness to stop life and to eradicate life in Gaza and to eradicate Palestinian life. It's also part of a wider strategy of reproductive genocide that also uses starvation as a weapon of war, constant displacement, and of course, sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls, yes, but also against men and boys. And this is important, and it will link to the question that you have around the inability to mobilize in solidarity within the SRHR movement, especially in detention for men and boys. There is also a campaign of targeting sexual and reproductive health information and services via the targeting of hospitals. When Israel specifically targets one of the main in vitro fertility clinic in Gaza, it is a clear signal that it actually, when you reach the point of wanting to destroy embryos, it becomes very difficult to spin a narrative that what you're doing is not reproductive genocide and that you're not trying to prevent birth. So, there are several declarations of intent by Israeli officials, and those declarations of intent, genocidal declaration of intent, are followed through by concrete actions, as in targeting hospitals. We have documentation. The Commission of Inquiry has received endless documentation of women and girls who die in pregnancy and childbirth simply because they are not able to access health services. This is also something that we had seen in Syria, for instance, where the Assad regime had also targeted what we call women and girls hospitals as, again, like a strategy to prevent birth. Malnutrition is also being used. Starvation is being used, as I mentioned, but also infection and inability to manage menstruation and postpartum bleeding with dignity. So we're seeing that it's as if Israel has taken kind of everything that comes under the umbrella of what is sexual and reproductive health and rights, and is targeting every single one of these elements. So the right to bodily autonomy for women and girls in Gaza means nothing, just like the right to health, the right to sexual and reproductive health are repeatedly violated. Beyond that, there is a targeting of anything that makes life possible, which we have a term for it: ecocide, urbanicide. So it's how do we destroy everything that makes life possible and that makes sustaining life possible. This is a strategy that is short-term, medium-term, but also long-term. The people of Gaza, Palestinian people, will have to deal with the consequences of this campaign of reproductive genocide for decades to come, not only in terms of their material conditions, not only in terms of enjoyment of their right, but also in terms of mental health impact. Which kind of brings me to the issue of mobilizing globally in solidarity with women and girls within the SRHR movement, to which I belong. First of all, I would kind of put the blames on states and the international community, who are giving free rein to the Israeli regime to perpetrate this genocide and this reproductive genocide, but also who are coupling their inability and lack of willingness to act by active defunding of organizations that speak out against this genocide. So there are several examples of major donor countries who have withdrawn the funds that they usually otherwise would have allocated to SRHR organizations, simply because these organizations are opposing genocide. So I would like us to all take a moment of what it means that when you, as a human rights organization or a development organization, come forward saying we oppose genocide, which should not be a controversial status, especially when everyone and their mother, every legal court, every special procedure has stated that this is genocide. you get defunded as an organization. It is to kind of break down the global solidarity movement. And in a world where, we have like a decrease in 60% overall in the gender equality sector in terms of funding, it carries its weight. I would say the other responsibility is around the legacy media that have been very happily kind of carrying the narrative that women and girls in Palestine do not exist, or are completely, like when you are in the streets and you're chanting "Free Palestine" and you hear Zionists saying like "Free Palestine from Hamas," or already the frame is, we have no agency as Arab women, Palestinian women have no agency. And then there is like dependent, and I think this is something that we do not speak about enough, is the complete dehumanization of Arab and Palestinian men and boys, where they are not allowed to be children, they are not allowed to be boys, they are not allowed to exist outside of this construction of being potential terrorists. And so it becomes okay to annihilate them and to dehumanize them because they're not humans. And we have had, like, there are several documentation of such statement by Israeli officials. And by enabling and carrying this narrative, traditional Western legacy media is kind of manufacturing consent for this genocide to happen. And the last point, I would say, it has been difficult to mobilize because, unfortunately, there's a lot of international NGOs that are Western, that most of them are US-based, that have not said a word and remain silent, and silence is complicity. They cannot, like in 5 years, when everyone would have been against this, they cannot pretend that they have used their role and they have used their clout and they have used their ability to influence major governments, including the present US administration. They have remained silent, and so it's become difficult to mobilize. That being said, and that would be my last point, it has become difficult, but it also is not impossible. And we have seen a lot of organizations of INGOs, for instance, but also a lot of grassroots organizations, a lot of like transnational movements be very clear and take a very clear stance. And we have seen that last March 8th during kind of the global March 8th strike, where it was very clear that global feminisms and feminism from the global majority said there is no feminism without Palestinian women, and there is no feminism without the liberation of Palestine. So I kind of keep hope that we can still mobilize for feminisms and around Palestine outside of what kind of these dominant Western so-called feminist women's rights organizations are doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I don't know how you managed to summarize everything in that answer. So thank you so much for that. We're going to start with the second round of questions. Before we take questions from the audience, just a reminder, you can send out your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to address them. Sana, I'll start with you for the second question. You were talking about the work that the Syrian women's political movement has been doing on the ground with all the discussions that were happening, the 17 political papers with the demands and what it is that women want on the ground. So my question is going to be a short one, but not a simple one. Can you give us your vision of what the role of women should be in this new period for Syria?
Yes, I mean, what it should be, I think it's like, it's the vision and the goal of the feminist movement for the last, forever. But I think, I mean, obviously, socially informed by the current reality, right? I mean, first and foremost, with the new phase in Syria and the new government, the first 2 months, there was so much hope, I would say, of like our opportunity and our chance to build a new Syria. And just not as Syrian women only, as the Syrian citizens, all of us, men and women never had the chance to participate in building the government and building our country. And of course, like now, this is like once in a life opportunity, right? When we as citizens have the opportunity to rethink how we build our country and how the constitution is really reflective of the citizens, of the diversity of Syria, and how the new government is reflective as well. And so I would say just to like, there are phases too of like our thinking of it. The first 2 months after the Assad regime was gone, and as I was in Syria, we all had so much hope of our ability to participate. And I would say, like, for those who missed it, who were not in Syria for these 2 months, I think it was, not I think, for a fact, it was a dream to be in the region, in a country in the region, in that place of the world where you really, I felt we had more freedom than anywhere else in the world. Like the amount of freedom that we had in these 2 months, the freedom of speech, freedom of movement as Syrians who are in Syria, the freedom of expression, the freedom to connect, especially, you know, like considering how we have learned to exist in our country in a way that's like there is a lot of internalized oppression. It's a level of freedom and liberation amongst all of us that we were there that I never experienced even in the US. And so that was just surreal to experience that in the region, to experience that in the heart of the region and in our country, even though it was like short-lived. And I would say like now the situation has changed. And it's worth acknowledging as well that obviously like last month, the massacre that happened on the coast, on the Syrian coast, that targeted a lot of the Syrian women and children and men. But, you know, this is like a huge event, right? Like, so it's important that also to clarify that the conflict and the violence in Syria has not stopped. The Assad regime is the main source of it, and of course we cannot understand the coastal event without understanding the 55 years of the Assad regime, and this is just a very basic expected outcome of it. But violence has not stopped, and women have not stopped facing and being actually like the first victims of this violence. And that being said, you know, we are trying to be involved as much as possible with the new government, right? And I think we're playing this game of like being patient and understanding that the new government has inherited a burnt country, a country with a lot of issues. I mean, really, no one envy anyone to be the president of Syria right now. Like, who wants that job? And yet, like, you know, they're there. And I think we all understand, of course, we're not naive to their background and where they come from. And yet, I would say, like, it's very important to note, especially for the Western audience, that the Syrian public in general, we had a big sense in Syria when you were there, you would understand it to be everyone wants this to succeed. Really, we want to give them a chance because it's in everyone's best interest and the country's best interest for this new government to succeed, to really work well, to reflect the people. And so as much as, you know, we have our reservations, we have been patient, right? Wanting to be like, it's only been month 2, month 3 of it, and we want to give them a chance. And that means doesn't mean like complicity, right, with the things that violate our beliefs and values and the revolution value. It means kind of like being patient but challenging when things are not aligned. So for example, the Syrian national dialogue that took place last month, it was supposed to take place even a few weeks after the Assad regime was gone, right? And the Syrian public in Syria challenged that, and the new government actually listened and postponed it. And we requested a preparatory committee, and the preparatory committee for that big conference, the first ever national conference where basically Syrians came under one ceiling and kind of spoke freely and connected freely. This never happened in Syria. Like, this is huge. And that preparatory committee included 2 women, right, out of 7 members. Is this ideal? Far from ideal. Is this a step? Yes, we'll take that step. We'll acknowledge it. I think it's something. And similarly now with the constitutional committee that working on the constitution that includes 7 legal experts, there are 2 women. Again, I don't love quotas, and I don't think numbers really reflect meaningful inclusion and representation and shared decision-making at all. And these processes lack a lot of transparency, even how these women were selected or any member was selected, what's the working, you know, the ways of working. There's a lot of issues with it. That being said, it's something, and we want to build on that. I think the attitude is that we can't, you know, we can't aim for like the highest bar when we are starting from really -10, right? We wanna meet this new government and with the reality of Syria where it is, and our vision is to continue to push to push when we need to push, to collaborate when we can collaborate, and to engage when we can engage as Syrian women and citizens in general with the new government in building our country. I mean, I envision a Syria or a process of building the new Syria where all of us citizenry of this country are really, and with all our backgrounds, really participating meaningfully in rethinking the country and being in all ministries and all governments and the new governments. And we see news today of leaks around the announcement of the new government in Syria. I mean, the interim government, right, for the next 5 years, the ministers, and they say there's like a female minister, and I'm like, one. Right. I mean, it's really, it takes a lot of, internal work to be like, yeah, that's great. But like, and we don't know in which capacity, right? I hope it's not the women like affairs office, right? And this is like another issue, like right now, like there's a women affairs office in Syria, and the main issue becomes around, women rights is when we isolate them, right? It's become like its own thing. It's not part of the bigger thing. And this is something we will work on. So I envision that we have a continued fight, a continued battle, and maybe a lot of opportunities with the new government to engage. And I have trust in my people, men and women, and in our ability to adapt and kind of being very politically savvy and figuring out ways to influence and to resist and to inform the new process.
Thank you so much, Sana. That was great. Next, we're going to talk about Sudan. Hala, Sudanese women have been at the center of organizing during the revolution and through women-led organizations like SIHA, and they've been doing incredible and crucial work documenting and responding to the situation on the ground. Despite all this organizing, have women's organizations and women-led organizations been included in shaping the country's political future? And have they been included in international peace negotiations?
Thank you very much. I don't think Sudanese were ever being included in any political process. Considering the long history of the Sudanese women movements, the impact that women are, making on, on political transformations and political processes, the fact that, I would say with confidence that more or less close to 60% of Sudanese households are headed by women. And I think right now, women are making critical decisions of life and death, in terms of their communities, saving lives, protecting, and so on. But the acknowledgement of the role of women has always been a challenge. And this acknowledgement, it's clearly manifested in the fact that Sudan has one of the worst legal frameworks when it comes to women's human rights. And it went on for 30 years during al-Bashir era, but even before al-Bashir and post al-Bashir, the engagements of women has always been more or less some sort of lip service, rather than a serious integrations of the women agenda. And I really like what, the colleague from Syria have addressed, that, the assumption that if you have, a secular, quote unquote, secular regime, that women have the full rights. That's an assumption that we need to interrogate more, and as SIHA and through my organizations, we have been challenging many of the civilians actors about, their positions when it comes to women's human rights, because in our view, and personally in my view, it doesn't differ much, from the positions of, political Islamists, except for the lip service. But when it comes to actual transformations, or in terms of equal citizenship, in terms of providing, or influencing change when it comes to the legal framework. That has not been happening. And this is, one of the reasons, in my view, that we are witnessing this massive scale of violence against women, particularly conflict-related sexual violence, because even with Sudan revolutions, and the amazing participation of women, we have more than 60% of the protesters were women at the front line. Even with this happening, sexual violence against women, it did not stop for a day. Women were continued to be raped in Darfur and other parts of the country. Women were raped in Khartoum during protests, not once or twice, but frequently. And sexual violence and sexual assault has taken place again. So it has never been a priority, even during the transitions or talked about. So the lack of acknowledgements of the women experiences, suffering and struggle, is one of the characteristic of Sudan, political setup, and this has enabled, these violations to happen comfortably without any anticipations of accountability. And of course, as African women, as predominantly, also Middle Eastern, to a large extent, large population in Sudan, they see themselves as Arab, and Muslims communities, there is an assumption often, that it's okay for our bodies to be brutalized and to be violated the way it is. And the best thing we should do is to be quiet about it and not to talk about it, ignoring the fact that, sexual violence in particularly and other forms of violations, like enforced disappearance, are primarily political crimes, and they are, perpetrated for political purposes. And so the absence of this agenda from the political process has been a pattern throughout Sudan history, and it continues until now. We are not present in the conversations around, conflict transformations. Our views are not being considered, when we are talking, except if we accept it to act as a proxy, but independently as women, as activists, as, grassroots groups of women who are bearing the burden of this conflict, taking care of each other, protecting each other, living the day-to-day struggle of of this war, and as refugees and as displaced. Definitely, there is no considerations. We are still, it's the same cycle of, just accessorizing the political processes by, inviting one or two, women who were, who can act as proxies, for patriarchal institutions, who has no sincere interest in making sure that the women agenda are present. And for that particular reasons, we strongly believe that it's really important and critical for grassroots women activists, and this is a conversation that we have been having for a while, is to try as much as possible to engage at the local level, to engage at the local government level, and to find their place within those structures so that they can amplify and have voices in that level. Because we think that, as feminists, that if we are speaking about true democracy, it has to be built bottom up, the times, after these brutal conflicts, we don't think that centralized, governments of centralized elites can allow peace and stability in Sudan, in the future. Sudan is the big country with multiple grievances, and the women are struggling in different regions. They have their different priorities, and this has to be taken into consideration. So that's a pursuit that we are working on, hoping to democratize, and diversify the space of women's capacity to influence politics, policy, and peace transformations. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hello. Next, Miriam, we're going to talk about Lebanon. Lebanon now has a new government. The municipal elections are set to take place in May of this year, parliamentary elections in 2026. And there is some kind of momentum for accountability and some possibility that we hadn't had in a while. What are the prospects for organizing in Lebanon, and what are the openings that you would love organizers to focus on?
So, as you said, the situation now is supposedly more promising. It's hopefully more stable. We have a new president. We have a newly appointed government. We have 5 women ministers out of the 24 that exist. On the level of organizing in Lebanon, I don't think it's different. So I'll give you an example. We just screened a documentary that we did on the women's movement. So as an institute, we've worked on a documentary on the women's movement since it started until the war years. And then we worked on women peace activists and showcasing peace activism in Lebanon. And not too long ago, within the context of a project that we're working on countering the backlash against gender rights, funded by the Institute for Development Studies and taking place in Lebanon, Bangladesh, India, Uganda, Brazil, and India, and Turkey. We worked on a documentary with a colleague of mine, Nair Rai, on the women's movement from the war years until before the August 4th blast, okay? So basically, most of the asks in the first documentary are very similar to the second documentary, because the asks were the asks that were actually also called for during the revolution, which I mentioned previously. And if we go back to what Saad Joseph has spoken about and how patriarchy persists and permeates everything related to social, economic, political, ideological, and psychological aspects of social and personal life in Lebanon, and every part of society has to be studied for its patriarchal practices and beliefs. So if we try to, and as you might well know, backlash is happening not just on the level of Lebanon, globally, regionally, etc. And within the context of the project that we worked on, we reimagined and redefined how backlash in Lebanon appears. And basically, we came up with a definition that is in stark contrast to the episodic definitions of backlash in mainstream literature that talk about how it's a various form of structural discrimination and exclusion that are fed and are incubated and are fueled by the sectarian system, and that not only fight and obstruct advocacy for rights, but also, and more importantly, they impede any possibility of progress. And this definition came as a result of our work on this project. And basically, the context in Lebanon is very complicated. There's a lot of momentum for change, as you're all listening to conferences taking place on Beijing Plus 30, the anniversary of CEDAW, and the fact that we still have reservations to CEDAW, the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council 1325. And my colleague Paula spoke about how human rights instruments are not always instrumental in fighting for this discrimination. And we have the 50th anniversary of the Lebanese war, the Lebanese civil war that took place. So there's a lot at stake. There's a lot that needs to happen. We need to be hopeful to continue. We need to challenge the sectarian system and build cross-community alliances. We need to strengthen those alliances and demonstrate, and this was demonstrated in the October 17 revolution. So this is possible. Of course, we need to challenge the patriarchal norms. These are all like big picture things, but like if we do them within the context of the work that we do through media or through art or through storytelling or through education or through basically like highlighting the narratives of women. And of course, we need data to do that. So I personally think there's a lot to be done on the level of women's political participation, exactly as you said. Like, it's unfortunate, the municipal elections are upcoming, the parliamentary elections are upcoming. We've had the right to vote since 1953 in a country that's obsessed with quotas. You have quotas for if somebody wants to be in the medical school in a university, for instance. So, and of course, as feminists, and like we need to discuss those. We don't just need any women. Of course, we need women who are holders of a feminist agenda, women who would advance all the asks that were there since the inception or since the women's movement came into existence. So, like, as I said, and there are so many platforms that we could do that. Definitely, there is momentum, but of course, for instance, a lot of organizations have lost their funding, and we need to bridge this divide between like feminists and what they're calling for, and like the women's movement in general, and we need to talk to each other, and building solidarities is something very important. So exactly, maybe amendment in terms of the electoral law. This is a priority, working on encouraging more women holders of a feminist agenda to join politics and to address all the discriminatory laws that are there, not to mention the engaging with the youth and like prioritizing the youth and their struggles, etc. So as you said, there's a lot upcoming, but also like Lebanon is always, like the context in Lebanon is always for me very volatile. And I think we need to always rest assured that there's so much to be done. And even though there are very many hurdles, we can work on maybe small gains until we reach I will share in the link the work that we've done and the work that my colleague did on Nairai on countering the backlash against gender rights and the redefinition that we came up with. And I will invite you to the screening of the documentary. We already did it in Iceland. We screened it in New York, and we'll be screening it in Lebanon. And I will share it with anyone who's interested in screening it online, because we can do things online now. So I will stop here, and I'm ready for more questions.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And the last question that we have for this round is going to be for Paula. And we're going to go even more regionally. How can we build cross-regional solidarity between women movements of the region, as we've been dealing with the invisibilization of Syrian, Palestinian, Sudanese, and Lebanese feminists globally, as if we, the women in the region, did not exist and did not have our own agendas? And what are some avenues for solidarity to amplify the demands of feminists of the region?
My apologies, my Zoom crashed very quickly, so I'm taking the call from my phone. Thank you for this question. I think we're at a particular political moment. I see that a lot of questions that are being asked, and a lot of my co-panelists have raised the issue of defunding of our movement, defunding of the feminist and gender equality movement. And I think this enables us to actually think about what we would look like if kind of the neoliberal practice of donor dynamics didn't kill our kind of organic solidarity movements. Because the movement looked very different before we became professional NGOs and professional organizations. Like I think the colleagues and the comrades in Palestine had raised that. I remember like almost 15, 20 years ago, telling us like, be careful with the influx of money from USIDF, it comes a lot of dynamics and conditions and collection of information, etc. And I think that we have been able to see it as well in other contexts, like in Lebanon, for instance, but not just. So I feel that now is a moment for us to kind of take stock of the impact of different major powers and major donor countries' foreign policy, including those who claim to have a feminist foreign policy, and what it has done to our movement, and what would become of us if we existed and we peeled away the kind of Western gaze. And I think that, cannot happen without also reconsidering and challenging and resisting the narrative that pertain to our societies and that pertain to women and girls of our region. I think that there is these common stereotypes around women and girls in the region, that, we are at the mercy of men, that our societies are extremely patriarchal. If patriarchy does not exist, I think that we should look at the US now to see what toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity actually looks like. So I feel that this is a crucial question that we need to sit with a bit around, what happens. I'm sorry, I'm seeing that there's echo. Is it better now? Yeah, okay. Technology is against me. I'm blaming fascism. And so just to sit with that question, what becomes of us when we kind of distance ourselves from those donor dynamics, and what becomes of us when we distance ourselves from that particular gaze and kind of reclaim our own agenda. Like feminism is not foreign to our countries, and feminism is not foreign to our regions. We have our own agenda, we have our own priorities, and the fact that the Western gaze, if I can put it this way, doesn't want to see and amplify that, doesn't preclude us from building global South solidarity with other regions from the global majority. Like we saw in 2019, when there was this wave of revolutions from Baghdad to Beirut to Santiago de Chile, that Chilean feminists were standing in solidarity with us, and vice versa. And so it's like, how do we harness that spirit, even though I know that the global context is facing a rise in fascism? I know that we are seeing cuts in our sector, and it's actually a moment for us to reimagine and reinvent what feminist solidarity looks like. And it might look very different from what we're seeing now, but I see it as an incredible opportunity to build networks of solidarity and to build almost kind of a feminist international where we amplify each other's demands, and when we visibilize each other's situation away from whatever Western legacy media chooses to visibilize. So I know that I'm leaving us with more questions and answer, and I apologize for that, but I myself I'm sitting with that question, and I would be happy to sit with others and to rethink collectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And for everyone for all those answers. I see that we've received so many Q&A questions. So if you have more, send them, but we're gonna try to cover as much as we can and try to lump them in as well as much as possible. First question is gonna be about the foreign aid pause. How has the US foreign aid pause affected women and girls, not limited to, but including in conflict zones such as Sudan and Gaza? How has the pause impacted women-led civil society movement in the region? So I'll let Hela and maybe Paula answer it, but I know that it's impacted all of the countries we've covered, so.
Paula, do you want to start, or would you like me to start? I'm happy either way.
Me too. Since you have the mic, go ahead, please, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'd like to stress that Sudanese women, they literally don't receive any, specific support when it comes to the, to the violation they are encountered. They had conversations with UNFPA a couple of months ago, and they literally they have less than I think 10% or something of their funding that's supposed to be available for women in Sudan. So it's the overall crisis of Sudan has received such small amounts of funding. The UN OSHA, I believe there's, they receive 6% of their total funding to Sudan. So humanitarian aid and basic necessities that would contribute to the protection, to the response to what women are encountering, what girls are encountering, what children are encountering is very, very minimal, compared to many, many countries and many crises around the world. Sudan is definitely at the bottom. And that speaks to the level of disregarding, to what we are encountering, literally completely abandoned, though being one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. In terms of the impact, it's not only the USAID cuts. The USAID cuts has led to the complete collapse of what we call emergency rooms, which is a community initiative that was led by volunteers and was receiving small amounts of resources from different organizations that was supported by, some of them are supported by USAID, but others are supported by other donors. And so I think there is more than 450 or 500, community kitchens or soup kitchens that they have been completely collapsed, and they were providing basic food and necessities. It's, as, SIHA primarily, my organization, the organization I work for, we work on protections, and those spaces, the community kitchens and soup kitchen, there were also spaces where we could engage in protections activities. That's right now, it's becoming extremely difficult to do that. So it's very devastating and miserable and beyond dire situation. I would like also to speak about the significant and the amazing role that was played by Sudanese diaspora and Sudanese communities in sustaining some of these initiatives. I don't think without them what would have happened, but we have pockets of famine, very real. Women are mostly impacted by this famine. We have, we can't even count the level of mortality rates. Women are delivering children under trees and by the side of the roads. Victims of sexual violence, they don't have access to sexual and reproductive health. It's extremely, extremely miserable. And we are trying to think creatively, because it's not only the USAID funding, but also, other donors and other funding sources. We have been constantly told that they won't be available to extend support as it used to be. So re-strategizing, rebuilding our movement more independently, that's something that's worth thinking about. Absolutely. Yeah. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Hala. Do you want to add to it, Paula, or do we go for next question?
I can quickly add to it. I echo everything that Hala has said, but I do think that it's worth mentioning that a lot of Middle Eastern organizations did not accept direct USAID funding, because that funding came with a lot of strings attached, and it came with a lot of conditions that several organizations and movements were not comfortable with. So in that way, it might be that it's not so much in terms of direct funding, but the cuts generally that are happening. And as Hannah has mentioned, not just from the dismantlement of USAID, but also from other major donor countries who are now redirecting their resources towards actually militarization. And that comes from countries who used to have, or who still have, what they call feminist foreign policy, even though feminists have been advocating for demilitarization of society. of society as kind of a precondition to realize a feminist future. So I think that there will be impact, either direct or indirect. I think that it was clearly irresponsible for so many of these major donor countries to withdraw their funds, because the impact will be loss of life. And we need to be very clear about that. USAID also supported a lot of programs where we were talking about delivery of medicines and commodities that were life-saving. And without that delivery, people will die, and that's it. And so we also need to have a conversation around how expendables our lives are. And so in the face of that situation, as Hala has mentioned, how do we recreate our movements in a way that we are less dependent on foreign aid?
Thank you so much, Paula. Now we barely have 5 minutes for questions, so I'm going to ask you to have short answers, even though they're huge questions. Next, Sana. There's a question on what happened in the coast in Syria and the need for revolutionaries to stand more clearly against all perpetrators. How can women lead in this effort?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the question, and thanks for asking it. And I don't know in which capacity I romanticize the new ruler. If anything, it's the opposite. But I mean, by all words and means, I condemn the massacre that happened in the coast. That I condemn the role that the security forces, the new security forces, played in it. I condemn the Assad loyalists who also instigated it. I condemn the Syrians who participated in it, and I condemn the foreign fighters who are part of the security forces who participated in it. The mercenaries who, God only knows who's supporting them between Iran and others who also participated in it. So I condemn strongly in all means and words the massacre, and everyone participated in it. And I have been very clear in my points in all my conversations about Syria now, that the new government has to take responsibility and accountability measures towards what happened, including persecuting their own people and forces who participated in that. And so by no means, I think there's a leeway around this massacre. And I think, if anything, it really kind of was, that being said, it was inevitable, right? And then secondly, I think a lot of the word revolutionaries, previous revolutionaries, it's very debated, right? Who is a revolutionary, and who was really part of the revolution was co-opted. Just the 2011 revolution was co-opted and continues to be co-opted by many different backgrounds and people. And so I would not categorize myself like those people with revolutionaries, and many actually, as we know, in the security forces, they are 20 years old right now. So when the revolution started, they were 9. And so it's important to put that into context. That doesn't not mean that there are many people who have kind of now become supporters, right, of the new government, who were part of the revolution 2011. And I think this goes back to the psychology of the Syrian citizenry and the internalized oppression, and just we have to understand just the desire to, and the urgency, right, to be part of someone else, to support someone. And just on the Syrian women side, I think just as they would continue to lead the way on accountability measures around Syria, on the bigger question of Syria, similarly on the coast. And we are there are so many initiatives by families, for example, of the disappeared, right, pushing and forcing the new government and international actor to really act on the issue of the disappearance, and they're leading efforts in terms of mobilizing communities and creating spaces for these conversations. I think similarly, the coastal events and this coastal massacre is part of it. And so just as we will be involved in many issues on accountability on Syria, I think Syrian women and Syrians in general will lead the way too.
Thank you so much, Sana. I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions if you manage to fit them in. So please, if they could be short answers. My first question is going to be for Miriam, even though the question was directed at Sana originally, but it's the same situation in the entire region. Quotas are a poor way to ensure women are well represented and are able to participate in public affairs. So what kind of guarantees or constitutional or in the legislation needs to be in place to empower women?
So basically, quotas definitely, I don't need to explain, our temporary measures, and especially within the women's movement in Lebanon, quotas was one of, like asking for the quota was one of the common asks between the feminist movement and the women's movement. So basically, we need to infiltrate women everywhere. We need to have them in political parties and more engaged in politics in general and political life, have them in trade unions. And of course, we need an electoral law that basically calls for fair representation of women. And there's so much to be done on the level of representation. And representation needs to start, and political engagement from schools and universities. It's very important to highlight the importance of voice and women's political representation, irrespective of the sectarian system that we have. So definitely they're not ideal, they're temporary measures as they're called. And in a system like Lebanon, and in a system that is highly sectarian, this was one of the asks that was common among all women's rights groups and the feminist movement.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I have a question for you, Paula. How do you think we can strengthen collaborations across different feminist movements in our region to address the shared challenges that we have? And what steps can we take to foster unity and collective action across borders? In 1 minute.
In 1 minute. Okay. I will try. I think that, first of all, we need to kind of see and recognize each other. I think there is a lot of fragmentation between our kind of at the national level and also in between different contexts. It's also by design, because the systems of oppression and domination under which we live strive on us being divided. So there is a need to kind of reactivate networks of solidarity, I think online, because mobility is such an issue within the region. And it's going to be more and more difficult to meet in kind of global spaces like CSW, so the Commission on the Status of Women, or the Human Rights Council, or other kind of UN global spaces. So it's about how do we also leverage the global spaces that are organized by other civil society organizations. I'm thinking about the AWID Forum, but I'm also thinking about the Women Deliver Conference that we organize every 3 years, that we really see as a big convening space for the movement to come together and strategize. And so in that space, we have more control over the space, how it is built, how it is delivered, and also how we can kind of intervene in terms of access to visas, etc. So that's kind of one part of it, but that requires resources to meet kind of in person. So for now, I would encourage us to organize kind of strategic meetings, like the one that you are organizing, Tahrir Institute, to have more of those, to have more of these conversations, collective conversations. And then the Marxist in me is going to kick in and to say, like, can we build actually a feminist international that has democratic structures inbuilt, so that kind of women and feminists of the global majority can come together, strategize together, uplift one another and one struggles of one another, and influence the global conversation.
Thank you, Paula. And yes, for having more of those conversations together and cross regional, because so many of our struggles are the same and very similar. And we're only stronger together. Thank you so much for this inspiring and fascinating discussion. I was very honored to moderate this. Up to you, May.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana, Hala, Paula, and Miriam, for really an incredible conversation. I know it's been a very difficult week. It's been a difficult few years for the region, but honestly, conversations like this give me a lot of hope. And so thank you. Thank you, Misha, for that fabulous facilitation. The discussion was really rich, and I think each of you have left us with a lot to reflect on. To our audience, thank you for your engaging questions and comments. You keep our conversations rich. And to the Time Up team who helped make this event possible, thank you for your hard work and efforts always. Audience members, you can keep up with Time Up's work on our website, www.timeup.org, or across our social media channels. Thank you all, and I'm wishing you a wonderful day.